you for coming. Thank you. To use the stories to understand, to have a better understanding of and between ourselves. And that works in all professions, I think.
Hello, my name is Trey Robinson, and I work for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion, and I also teach multicultural gender studies, and I would like to welcome you all to today's conversations on diversity and inclusion. Before we begin, I do want to thank Karen Lightfoot here from the School of Nursing for the collaboration to bring Dr. September Williams here to our campus to talk about an area of diversity that we often don't get the focus on, which is the process of dying as it relates to a cultural context. And without any further ado, yes, and tonight at 6 o'clock in Calusa Hall, Dr. Williams will be screening the entire film. She's going to show just a piece of it today, but do show up. It's a free event. There'll be some appetizers as well, and it's at 6 o'clock in Calusa Hall. So, without further ado, Dr. September Williams.
Thank you. I don't need to be nice. Thank you so much. That's an interesting theater space. So I don't know where to look. I'll be at this angle here. I never meant to become a filmmaker. I was always interested in stories, and I wanted to know how they worked from the time I was really young. Thanks to Dr. Seuss, okay? I always wrote, and my first writing that was published at the Westminster Elementary School campus crier when I was 8. It was a review of the opening of the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion at the Music Hall in LA. And I was psyched from then. I was also an only child until I was 24 years old. Yes, my mother was a cougar, okay? So when I was younger, until I was about 10, the television was my best pal. When I was 10, I met the 35 millimeter camera, and it usurped the position of the television until I started medical school. When I would be looking through the lens of a camera, I wasn't talking, which was a good thing for everybody, but my focus was on the little story that would happen inside of the frame of a picture. That made me begin to think about how the relationship between different forms of narrative worked. I found myself writing poetry, making up the rest of the story from that picture of who I just saw on the beach or who I just saw hiking. In hindsight, it was inevitable that I would do a stint in film school. People were sort of surprised that I went to film school after I was a physician. But in reality, I went to film school because I was a physician. I did a bioethics fellowship at the University of Chicago. It's one of 4 subspecialties for me. That bioethics fellowship taught me at the time of my primary training between 1984 and 1992, along with my critical care fellowships and those other things. It taught me that the stories that I heard from people were absolutely essential to how you get information medically. In the bioethics fellowship, when I came out, I went to work in a trauma center. In that trauma center, I was still thinking about stories and how they worked and the stories that people tell you when you take the time to hear them, when you're interviewing them clinically. And one of the things that happened was that I was talking to a woman who had recruited me as her doctor in the emergency room. What she did was she was in a gurney, she was very sick, she was a Russian immigrant Jewish woman, and in this busy emergency room and trauma center, she had asked a nurse to see if that woman could be her doctor. I was the only black person in the trauma center, and that night I was the only woman that was working in the trauma center as a physician. And I was like, yeah, I was speaking Spanish with somebody over there. I didn't speak Russian. Her English wasn't great. I didn't know what was up with that. I went, and very quickly, I could see that she was very sick. Her breathing pattern, I listened to her chest. I knew that she had wells. I knew by palpating that she had a tumor. And I began to prepare her for that as we were getting her to x-ray and these things. When she came back, the x-ray said that, and then I got my translator to come and talk and explain to me, explain to her what I was about to tell her, because I wanted to be sure that she understood. She had a massive tumor. In those days, the Russian immigrant person who had come to the US had a cough. You assumed that they had cancer until proven otherwise because of the level of air pollution and things in the environment. So we go through this, and she looks up at me in very clear English, and she says, "I mustn't worry. You're a good doctor. You will take care of me." And I said, Betty Davis, 1939, Dark Victory, right, where this character basically said to this man, doctor, that you'll take care of me. And I said that to her, and she said, "Oh yes, I learned so much of my English from old American films," right? It started me thinking about what happens on those big screens and what people hear and how they translate things from film. This was one of those things that took me to film school. The translator, later I was whining about the fact that she just was abdicating her will to me because I was a doctor. He gave me a completely different point of view. His point of view is that you're being kind of arrogant about that. You're assuming that this woman doesn't know what she's doing. That was a new view for me as a bioethicist. And I said, well, go on. And he said, the relationship between black Americans and many people in the world is different. He was also Russian immigrant. He said somewhere between jazz, art, Josephine Baker as a war hero, all of these different things, people find a common cause around struggle. So she picked out a black woman doctor because she thought that there might be some form of shared experience between you. And you were assuming that she's not smart enough to know what she's doing. So my head is spinning by then. Okay. About 3 months later, I applied to film school using a series of poems and photographs that I had taken years before as my portfolio for film school because I'd never made a film. That's how I ended up going into the master's program at Columbia College, Chicago, and then at Boston University. But what I learned is that what other people know, bioethical issues and bioethical content, okay, evolves from stories. So if the bio part is everything in the biosphere. So I write fiction novels now about environmental issues, romance suspense, because that's who I want to talk to. People who read it very often have kids. Kids can be taught things, and then they learn things, and then they go out and they vote when they grow up. It's important, right? So I started looking at the role of narrative in bioethics, and there is no more powerful role of narrative in bioethics than through the screen, because it is a part of all of the arts. It's the seventh art. It includes all of the arts. It's theater, it's painting with light, it's all of those things. And it's a very powerful, powerful thing. I had an opportunity, since this is Black History Month, and since we are facing an epidemic right now that is rising, okay, I grew up in medicine during the era of HIV/AIDS rise. And as a result of the events around the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study at Tuskegee, Alabama, what we were finding in the 90s is that as the number of African Americans were disproportionately in the population having more HIV, as well as other poor people, whether or not people were gay, whether or not they were men having sex with men, or this was going on, and the messages around prevention were not getting out, we realized that what was being heard is people were not interested in being involved in research because they were African Americans, and they were all saying things like, we know about Tuskegee. We know about the Tuskegee study. Well, the language of the Tuskegee study was somewhat problematic because the Tuskegee study was actually the U.S. Public Health Service study at Tuskegee, Alabama. But saying Tuskegee meant that it was like as if the university was in control of it. So anybody who works in a university knows that funding comes from different sources and those kinds of things. The control of that study was never in the hands of that university, but the study resulted in a lawsuit brought to us by 600 black men in Alabama that was the very first, after 40 years, after the World War II, after the Helsinki Declaration and the prior to that Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code about how research is done, this study was still going on, and a whistleblower broke this case. In the early 1970s, the Nixon administration was met with the first class action lawsuit that was ever brought against the United States government by a group of 600 black men from Alabama and their heirs. Right? That resulted in establishing the rules in the United States that allowed for using the rules of the United Nations work and the Helsinki Declaration that evolved out of the Nuremberg Code, which is a one-page thing that has 10 things on it, basically. And the first thing on it says that research must have a hypothesis. There must be something that has to be tested. The second thing says is that participants in a study have to provide informed consent. They have to know what that research is and have to buy in it. And then there are 8 more things. Well, those first 2 things were not honored in what was called the Tuskegee study, because the Tuskegee study started when there was no cure for syphilis. And in 1934, a philanthropic organization provided money at Tuskegee University and in Alabama to help to have the study look at those things. So they were doing arsenioles and doing different things. In 1936, the Depression was raging, the money disappeared, but the federal government was the recipient of that money and passing it out. They wanted to keep the study going, and they kept sending doctors from Atlanta to Tuskegee University to continue the study, okay? But there was no hypothesis. They changed the name of the study to, it's so crazy even when I say it in my head. So they changed it to say that this was the study of the natural history of syphilis in the Negro male. Well, it didn't meet the criteria of the Helsinki work and the work on the Nuremberg Code, because in Oslo, Sweden, there had already been some 26,000 people that we knew the natural history of syphilis. There was no hypothesis, and there was some harm done. I'm telling you all this is because this is how we literally came to have the rules in bioethics that were happening. It came as a gift. The men that were survivors in the Tuskegee study, when they realized that this new disease had come up that was sexually transmitted, and black people were not participating, and they weren't participating because they didn't trust the medical structures, but The case that was brought was won, but it was settled under gag order by the US government in 1974. The only way you could break the gag order was with a presidential apology. So they petitioned for a presidential apology. And the apology was made. So then it became clear that there was a 40-year collusion of people who, long after there were rules about bioethics and all of those things, were doing this basically to keep jobs going for them. Here's why this movie was made. In the process of the apology, I went to work at Tuskegee, Alabama to open the Bioethics Center with the team from the CDC that was a part of the apology. When you get a presidential apology, funding goes someplace. I was asked by then David Satcher, the head of the CDC, where I thought the new Bioethics Center that dealt with these things should go. And they, Harvard, Yale, different people wanted it, and I said, well, the rules of bioethics says equipoise, the people who got the most harm should get the most benefit. Well, it was the reputation of Tuskegee University, which is lauded for turning out some of the best people in their fields from some of the poorest communities in the United States. Those are the people whose reputation had been burned and fried. So I was there. Out of that work, we were looking at end-of-life issues, not just around AIDS and those things, but also from chronic disease and health disparity. The result of that is that we made the decision that in end-of-life care, people who have more disease and who are poorer and have less information about those diseases appear to be dying worse than people who have more support, more information, better understanding. That's what we were noticing clinically. But nobody had really looked at it in detail. Robert Wood Johnson's foundation was tapped to ask for a teaching program that would be able to give information to allied health science students, nurses, doctors, anybody who social work. You have to remember, hospice was new in the United States during this period. The thing is that we got funding for this teaching program, a series of trigger tapes and things, but then 911 happened. And Robert Wood Johnson's and other endowment organizations were blown up in New York, as well as people. But the nation was thrown into dealing with acute trauma around end-of-life issues. It took years for us to actually get the opportunity to go out and shoot this film that looked particularly at African Americans. We did that. There was a block of time where these were done as teaching tapes. 2005 to 2010, the teaching tapes were done. In 2014, the editor of this film said to me, that stuff is done now, some things are changing, but the general public has never had an opportunity to see the things that we did. And what was important is that I didn't actually do what I was asked to do or what I said I was going to do, which was teach these. We shot several hundred hours of film that started with, if you guys had said you wanted to do interviews, I would say, are you sick right now? Is anyone you know sick with a life-threatening illness? I didn't start out with, well, Dr. So-and-so, or just so. And the answers that we got were enormous. But what we learned, crisscrossing the country, talking to black people who served black people who stood in solidarity with black people, was that the dialogue was not about how we were different, but about crossing over and how we were the same. We went back into the footage and we made a 60-minute documentary that could be used for teaching and those things without the infrastructures of doing these things. And because the footage I owned the copyright for, we recut and we looked at some of the things to use them for this purpose. And I'm going to show you a little bit of that film. And tonight, and this evening, I'm going to show you more of it. We'll have a little bit of time for conversation. I'm going to show you about 10 minutes, okay? And then we can talk a little bit before everybody has to go off and do things that are way more important than hearing me run my mouth. Two cars cross a bridge at the same time. They pay the same toll. One arrives at the other side in 5 minutes, the other in 50. Anything could have happened to cause this disparity. It's the subtleties that make it hard to figure out. For African Americans, there is disparity in the quality of end-of-life care. We wanted to find out why. As a physician bioethicist, I know the people with any problem usually have the solution somewhere in their experience. That's why we decided to ask them.
Our culture is a culture of relationships. We have to understand that it's not going to be about what pill it is or what procedure it is or anything that has to do with the intellect. For African Americans, it's heart to heart, soul to soul, and spirit to spirit.
Hey, get my sugar. I know you gotta give me a. What we provide in our clinic is palliative care. Primarily, it's just to make sure they have a decent quality of life. Open your mouth for me.
If you look at most health conditions, whether it's cardiovascular disease, cancers, strokes, diabetes, communities of color are disproportionately impacted.
Poor people in America, all over America, black, white, Native American, Hispanic, and others, said one thing insistently, that when they developed cancer, they had a very difficult time navigating the healthcare system. There were so many barriers in getting through, even when they had a lethal disease.
He went to radiation, was doing real well. The pharmacy gave him a wrong medicine, and he had to go in hospital. He was in intensive care for a long time. By the time we're thinking he's getting ready to come home and be all right, and they say he had this cancer in his lung.
It was after the chemotherapy, the second round of chemo, and I raised him asking, did Kaiser A have a palliative care program, and did he think that it might be beneficial to her if we explored that? And he was like, oh, yeah, well, maybe that's a good idea. So it wasn't, to me, at that point, I wondered, had I not raised it, what we would have done from November until she passed away in February.
My father is from the generation that they don't really question the doctor. They're intimidated by their doctor, by the physician. And the doctor, this one doctor that he had seen for years, his word was final.
Mrs. Cooper, how are you doing today? Oh, I'm fine. I'm doing fine. I'm just feeling fine. If you had any problem, no, I'm doing really just great. And I was like, Mom, didn't you, I'm kind of recounting all these things that she was experiencing, but her response was that, well, no, it's okay. And she didn't want me to be aggressive with the doctor. I might make him upset, or I might make him mad.
Do I feel that my father's diagnosis was missed? Absolutely, I do.
My biggest fear about going to a hospital is who's going to be there 24/7 if I'm not able to make a decision to make decisions for me? And I think we're experimented on a lot in the hospital.
The practice of medicine at its core is it's a moral enterprise, but it's founded upon a covenant of trust.
My experience as a black person was somewhat likened to the experiences of the culture here in the Hawaiian Islands. People were oftentimes shoved to the side, not given the same attention. It's the same kind of thing that we experience back on the mainland when you are dealing with white America and black America. Around the world, people have been conditioned that if you are a people of color, no matter where you have come from, that you're still going to have some biases thrown at you.
In the United States, in general, there's a bimodal peak of suicide. It tends to happen in young teenagers and young people, and it tends to happen in the older people. In the Marshall Islands, it's mostly in this young generation. Usually males between 16, 18 to close to 30 have been committing suicide. In Chuuk, which is one of the Pacific Islands, in the Marshall Islands, it's the highest rate in the world, hands down. The mental health and the ability to deal with problems that happen in this changing culture and the shifts in the culture, the community is unable to deal with that, and so it's actually epidemic. Tradition and culture evolves and changes. I think what's unfortunate is when it evolves and changes at someone else's pace.
Maybe you can't eliminate poverty, but you can change the things that poverty causes.
How does a child affect my thinking? She keeps me here. Every time she smiles at me. Like I don't want to be a burden to her or my partner. I certainly don't want to be in a hospital, but it's absolutely fine to go crawl off somewhere and pass away. We come and we go.
Well, in my mom's care, we had she spent some time on the Japanese wing, and so she had a variety of Japanese nurses that were taking care of her, and she had Korean nurses that were taking care of her. There were South American LVNs from Nicaragua, Filipino nurses and doctors. We had Jewish doctors that were taking care of her. Respiratory therapist was African American. Some of her nurses at night were directly from Africa. There was also another issue of our family being recipient and welcoming of other cultures into my mom's room.
When clinicians don't understand or appreciate these cultural values and traditions in African American families and patients, there often arises conflict and misunderstandings in discussions around goals of care and palliative and end-of-life and hospice care. And therefore, African American patients and families often don't get access to the very kinds of services that they would need to help meet basic human needs and to relieve suffering when facing life-limiting illness.
Freedom, inequality, freedom, inequality, freedom, inequality. I'd like to tell y'all what they mean to me, just as for all, not just for a few. Do unto others, you would have done to you. Changing the channels from station to station, getting tired of the whole situation. Violence and suffering I see on the news, keeps me informed, it gives me the blues. One planet, one people, one destiny. If you don't get it together, we're all gonna be history.
In terms of ethnicity, I consider myself Puerto Rican, Latino. I consider myself black. Well, I don't consider myself black. I am black. My great-grandfather was a Senegalese slave. I also have Caribe blood and the dreaded Spanish blood. As my dad used to say, whatever you can get killed for, that's what you are. And I think that they would kill me for being black.
In the years immediately following my mother's stroke, she had bouts of seizures. I remember her being brought into the hospital on a stretcher in a seizure, aphasic, and being shunted to the side as a drunk. The crazy, sad, maddening thing is that in a racist society, you might expect that treatment from white doctors. You don't expect it from black doctors, but you get it.
I've lived half of my life, my own life, in legalized segregation, and the other half in a country whose laws are fair, but the hearts and minds of the people not necessarily fair. And so I had to try to understand this historical experience and what then was that a
See you tonight. Any questions? We have a couple of minutes.
I'll make a comment. If you're going to speak, if you could use this for the sake of the camera. I was having some flashbacks a little bit in regards to the health care received growing up in Compton, which was very minimal because of the lack of money that we had. So some of you all who have never been in the inner city would be surprised by some of the spaces where we had to go to get medical treatment, which, and I'll exaggerate a little bit, but it looked third worldish. If I could compare to, for example, spaces like in Chico, California, where you would go get medical care. My mom cares for my niece who has severe disabilities, and my mom, who's originally from Mississippi to Memphis to LA, now in Chico, she's had to fight for health care for my niece, and oftentimes she gets into arguments with the providers, and a lot of it has to deal with cultural competency. So I'm often the mediator between the two, and they're not understanding what she's trying to say because she's passionate, and she knows that she needs to work for my niece to get care. So she'll go above and beyond to prove her point, when oftentimes the providers are feeling threatened by her emotions and her care for her niece. And as a result, my mom feels that my niece isn't getting what she needs sometimes. So brought up a lot of memories that are happening currently, as well as things that have happened in the past in relationship to my experience being black, person of color. But appreciate the film and the work that you've done.
Thank you. Do you mind if I sit, even though?
No.
Well, no, I won't, because I have cameras, and why would I sit?
Oh, sure. Hello, my name is Vivi. I would scroll through social medias like Instagram or Facebook, and there would be this conversation about black people going to hospitals and explaining issues they're having, but the doctor's not believing them, and then that would result into them dying when it comes to women giving birth because the doctors aren't believing the issues that they're having. So maybe you could explain why that is a problem, or there's a stigma about that.
Of not believing people. Some of it is education. What happens is that when you go into a profession, you spend a bunch of time learning what the profession does. Bioethics came into being because what we learned was that the profession is not always trustworthy if they don't have some guiding light that they're using. Built into that is that the guiding light gets overrun. It takes a long time to have a decent conversation with somebody. When you come into a clinic, well, everybody here has been to a clinic or a doctor at some point. You come into the room, right? And somebody's got a checklist. First you've filled out a form outside, then there's a checklist. You've got one thing that there's time for that doctor to deal with. When the reality is a lot of times people go to the doctor for reasons that are not on that checklist or the dialogue. So we got footage because we didn't ask, what do you think about end-of-life care? We asked, are you sick right now? Is anybody close to you sick right now? Open questions, not closed, direct questions. I think that because they only ask, we are trained to only ask what is currently relevant based on whatever form or hospital or institution you are asking a series of things from people and trying to fit everything that gets said into that series instead of listening. And I was in this bright moment in time where we were up to our gluteus maximi in alligators. AIDS was what we didn't know what it was, We didn't, I think about the epidemic we're going through right now. And by the way, do you know what the right answer is on any health science exam that you may take about what is the single most public health intervention? What is the single most, anybody know? The answer is hand washing, okay? Just remember that, okay? Now that's not too complicated, right? But that is an open question, right? Which makes you run through a whole bunch of things. The answer is hand washing. That's what the science is. The problem is that if you give A, B, and C, right, then people are already put into that little box. Somebody could say covering their mouth. Well, that's real close, okay, but then you still have to wash your hand. The point is that people are checking off the boxes as opposed to listening and crossing over with that human being that they are in the room with at that time. The men from the Tuskegee syphilis study recognized that they were a part of an experiment that resulted in putting urban myth out there, but also outlining that there was real racism and assumption. For instance, people say, oh, these poor old black men from the South. The man who actually broke that study was Charlie Pollard. He had the first cotton gin in Alabama, right? These were smart men who were black men. When reporters started showing up in the stockyards saying, we heard there's something about this going on, he didn't say, yeah, blah, blah, blah. He said, give me your card. And he took his card to his attorney. He was a constitutional attorney, and he realized that there was something up with this story. That's how the suit. But he had Attorney Gray already. He was already his attorney. He was not an idiot. This was collusion. The assumption that you walk into a room and because you're black, we figured out through this film that there are things that we learned that are consistent. The important things when you're dealing with people crossing over is, we call it FASI, family, F-A, right? What their family is. S, their struggles, knowing what their struggles are. Not as a group, but that person's struggles, okay? So we want to know what they are. Something about their spirituality, okay? That's not religion, but what drives them, what they believe, and those things. And to look at people's icons of culture, okay? You are wearing a t-shirt with a black woman with a fro on, and you choose to present yourself that way. Some days I present myself that way. Some days I have a French roll, and some days my hair is out, okay? So you have to, if you are talking to a Native American woman and she is wearing a choker with a series of beads she is presenting that way. There's a dialogue to be had with that person. So the problem is they're so busy checking off the boxes because that's what it's come down to. Part of this is the digital age. Bioethicists are often called in as specialists. So as clinical medical ethicist, I've gone in as a specialist to get to the bottom of this stuff. I stopped practicing clinically about 4.5 years ago. I still did bioethics consults for a couple of more years. And then I stopped doing those. So when they call me, I say, I'm not doing consults, but I will walk you and your team through this case. Because it doesn't do any good for me to go home with all of that information when you all are the people who are going to be taking care of this person. Every person who is involved clinically needs to be a bioethicist, and can be, but it starts with listening. Does that help?
Thanks for the question.
Mine's not a question, but I wanted to speak from both a provider's perspective and a recipient of care perspective as a person of color. I think we have a long way to go with educating the nation about the black patient, whether it's in the clinical setting or it's in the ambulatory care setting. My challenges have been, I go into the hospital setting with nursing students as a professor, and the patient will look at my student and say, are you going to be my nurse? They would direct all their questions, even after the student has introduced me to the patient as this is my professor, she's going to be, oh, this is my professor, just like that. The patients normally will look at the student and ask questions about their medical conditions, focusing on the students and sort of disregarding. And so that's a challenge from the very beginning. And it doesn't take long before they realize, and acknowledge my presence, because they don't have a choice, especially if they are receiving care. But if they did, I can see how in other instances, there is still that bias regardless of what knowledge you have to offer. It's just a bias that's upfront. And as a recipient myself, I have gone into the hospital quite a bit for myself and my kids. At some point, I had 9 surgeries with my son in 1 year. And the treatment that I mostly received, or that our family received, just walking in, there's just this assumption that you have no clue what's going on. The explanation of the disease process is very basic upfront, to a point where you are just judged walking in that you don't know anything. And even the information is very limited for the progress or for the updates. Just as far as I'm concerned, for no basis at all, other than you've walked in and you are a person of color, and the assumption is you have limited knowledge. You don't really understand. A few times I've had to maybe dig for that information and maybe mention that I'm also in the profession. Could you be a little bit more? But there is still a long way that we need to go in terms of educating the public. Now, what really maybe is a heavy burden on my heart is we have a lot of other minority groups, whether it's a sexual orientation, whether it's, racial minorities, but it looks like we've made so much progress, say, in the sexual minority groups in advancing their cause, but we really haven't made that much progress in healthcare in terms of the black patient. I think there's still a lot of stigma, there's still a lot of bias, and I couldn't appreciate this anymore than I'm trying to express my appreciation. So thank you so much for this awareness. And I think we can continue to do this and bring more awareness to the nation regarding those biases.
This is the reason my editor insisted that we go back and create a film that didn't require you to do a 3-day workshop or things that we did with the initial work on this, is because we found ourselves quoting things that people in the subjects are saying, all the filmmakers that were involved did, and it was sort of like, there was so much wisdom in that. But I've had that experience, and I trained at Cook County Hospital when it had 3,000 beds and 700 bassinets. And then I went to the University of Chicago for fellowships. When I got there, it was a remarkable situation. At that time, it was 1990. I was very fortunate in being allowed to take my newborn baby with me, because I was going to stand out of the fellowship that I'd been accepted to, because I didn't want to abandon yet another child to my profession and not be able to nurse her. And they said, we're a bioethics center. Bring her with you for at least the first 6 months. Stunned I was, okay. But I was a big black woman with the baby in the south side of Chicago, and we started having this dialogue. Marion Grace Secundi, the former Bill Gray's sister, who was the House Ways and Means, she basically just took it to the wall. We did a book that year that I was at University of Chicago, and this is in the 90s, called It Just Ain't Fair, Bioethical Perspectives for African Americans. And that book has now been redone, not by the same group, but in honor with the same name. But the reality is we had some bright moments in time, but we seems to be going backwards. And the reason is back to what the sister there had said, is that everybody wants a shortcut. There's no shortcut. There is no shortcut. You have to take the time. You have to look at each individual. You have to be committed to understanding them, their family, their struggles, their things. And when you're dealing with people and illness, you cannot treat everything as though it's a hangnail. And you don't know if it's a hangnail or if it's a cancer until you've gotten far enough in with it. But that takes time. You'd have to be paid for that time, right? It's an interesting thing to see the way Kaiser has dealt with the ability to, and I'm just mentioning them because I know them, there may be other organizations that do this, but you can do video visits in Kaiser. What they have sorted out is that doing a video visit actually allows you to have more time. It decreases the ability, people don't have to travel and waste time by traveling from one place to another. You can schedule things at different times, and you can have a dialogue. So because you have a half an hour that is uninterrupted, or longer if you need it. This is a very important thing for someone who makes film. We take information in and stories on screens, some of them scripted, some of them documentary, some of them live action interaction, right? But when you are sitting with someone in their living room, right, it's very different than when you make them come to you. You are seeing them in their living room. You may still be in a starched area, but you are seeing the picture behind them in the wall. You are seeing their grandchild run up and ask for a cup of water, right? Because they're in the living room. There is no shortcut to crossing over. You have to do it one person at a time. And when you do it one person at a time, you eventually get to everybody, because you start hearing the same themes over and over again. FASI were the themes that we heard: family, struggle, spirituality, and icons.
We'll finish with this question as we're about to end.
I want to thank you for bringing this conversation here today. And what dawns on me, how important, I mean, this is not what dawns on me, but this is important. These are important conversations. These are important stories to be airing. And I wonder, because stories touch the heart, as a bioethicist, and you're exposed time after time to stories, how do you take care of yourself?
That's a good question, okay. As a bioethicist who also has 3 other subspecialties, you find yourself being overworked and doing these things. But the honest to goodness truth is that if you take the time, you do not burn out. But you have to take a position, right? I am a physician. You cannot tell me what I should know about the person in front of me. I am the person who is getting the read back from a person. Just like in the interview. Do I think my father's diagnosis was missed? Absolutely I do. I got that because I had an inkling from what she was saying. She didn't say that outright. I think it was like, so I asked so that she could talk about that, right? And she is one of the characters that runs through the things. That was before she started crying, right? That was before, while she had her mask up. The problem is that medicine is not a business. The truth of the matter is that you have to work on not burning out, right? You have to stand up for it. You have to say, how dare you? Okay? How dare you? This is my degree. If I miss this, right, then, and you know what? I've never been sued, practiced medicine for 32 years in some of the craziest wilding settings in the world, okay? I still have patients from the VA who call me every July when the new residents come in and they change all their meds to whatever the newest and wildest thing is, and it's like, can you talk to them? I'm like, nope, but let's get you back in touch with your social worker, right? Because you really were doing well, and let's, you know, helping people navigate the complex system is important. But if you don't make that connection, you can't do that. That is what sustains me. And also now being able to record those stories and those characters, not just in film, but to recognize when other people have done it well, to promote films that demonstrate the same principles that I am interested in, and to write novels that widen the circle, like Chasing Mercury and The Elephant in the Room and Breast Milk Banking. So that is the thing that makes me, to use the stories to understand, to have a better understanding of and between ourselves. And that works in all professions, I think.
Please help me thank Dr. Williams.